Thank you, Jennifer. I'm stepping forward. Close your eyes.
Thank you.
Stepping forward. So hi, everybody. Yeah, it's as you know, tonight's event is all about the maintainers. And our guests tonight are Lee Vinsel and Andrew Russell, who have authored The Innovation Delusion that we'll be hearing more about tonight. They also founded The Maintainers, and if you follow their work, they believe we should all do more to recognize the people behind the scenes who actually make civilization work at the large scale and at the small scale. So I'd like to take this as an opportunity to thank all of the maintainers here at Long Now Boston for putting on the Long Now Boston Conversation Series events every month from September through June, year after year. So I want to give a quick hello and a heartfelt thank you to the core crew here behind the events. There's Gary. Gary, I want to thank you for all that you do to manage the events team and running the technology for Long Now Boston events. I see you've got a little statue behind you, Gary. Can you tell us what that statue is all about?
Oh, sure, yeah. That's an Emmy that I got a couple of years ago for some software that I wrote, some visual effects software. I built a company called GenArts on one basic idea. We had one foundational idea, and we ran with it for 20 years there. So yeah, I'm definitely a believer in building something that you care deeply about and maintaining it and improving it all the time, rather than just chasing the shiny new thing of the moment.
Outstanding,
so,
outstanding.
Yeah, it felt like a real validation of that ideal to get that Emmy, actually, for that long-term commitment.
And also seeing it, that tool being used in the arts and industry and movies downstream throughout the industry. So
it's pretty fun.
Yeah, absolutely. You get to go to a movie and go, I did that. It's me.
Yeah, that's right.
Fantastic. I also want to thank Mary. Thank you so much for the enormous amount of effort you put in the background, hidden away, helping people getting signed up for events, getting them into the Zoom room, helping sort of debug their user experience for our events. You do an enormous amount of work in the background. So I really, really kind of very much a heartfelt thank you to you. Tell us, what have you been doing in your copious spare time, Mary, for the past 6 months? Because I know you just have bags of free time.
I have actually been doing everything I can to get more people vaccinated. Most of my out of the house time has been at vaccine clinics. So
time well spent. Go Vaxxers. Excellent. Nice job. Nice job. Jennifer, I want to thank you for being a wonderful announcer and a very dedicated and conscientious team member. Tell us, I know you're very into biology and botany. Tell us what is it about biology that you love?
It would be a little easier to tell you what about biology I don't love. And that is the truth. I love everything about it. I'm very interested in bacterial genetics, for example. I do a lot of microbiology work, and I'm trying to understand microbial communities and the ecology of microbial communities. But one of the things that I do with that is try to understand interactions, not just with each other, but also with hosts. And that's sort of where the botany comes in. I'm very interested in the plant sciences. So I'm currently actually doing some work in the cultural heritage field, where we're trying to understand microbial communities that are associated with our tangible heritage. And so I really just love engaging people with that, teaching people about all the different aspects of science, and for me, it's like a puzzle where you can put together from the smallest, molecular, cellular sort of level, and then integrate it into larger ecosystems. And, it's, for me, that connects with the Long Now thinking, it really speaks, because everything that I do, I feel is in, looking toward the future, whether it be, trying to understand plant disease and looking at food security, or trying to reduce food insecurity, or if it's trying to preserve and protect heritage items, for future generations to enjoy. So, all aspects of that are really, for me, are all about the future.
The larger context. Terrific.
Exactly.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Kim, thank you so much for your continuous creative inspiration and chat room expertise. I'd love to hear, after your storied career managing events, what is the largest event that you've ever produced, Kim?
Other than your 13th birthday.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm not exactly sure. I mean, we could talk about large events, but even more than that, it's events like this, I think, that are really important. I've done a lot of corporate events, done a lot of theater. And what it really comes down to is not the PowerPoint slides, not the scenery, not the costumes. What it really comes down to, what's the message that's being delivered? And that's why I really love doing these things. They're so raw and they're so down to earth, and we can share so much information among each other. But even more than that, it's bringing people together for good and sharing information among all of us and letting everybody go out and sneeze and tell everybody else about long now concepts and precepts. So everybody, when this is over, even before it's over, go out and tell everybody about Long Now Boston, right?
And the maintainers and the innovation delusion. Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, thanks, Kim. And Anurag and George, thank you so much for hosting tonight. You get all the glory because you're gonna run the event itself. But thank you for your efforts there. I also want to thank all the other members of the Long Now Boston Steering Committee beyond the events team itself and the board. You guys do a fabulous job month after month, year after year, keeping the show on the road and maintaining an ever-improving experience for our membership and community. So thank you all. I now want to hand back to the main flow of the event here.
All right, I'll take it. Thanks, Grant. I'm George Gantz, co-hosting with Anurag Singh tonight, and Anurag is a new face for us on the big screen. So just want to introduce him real quickly. He's a member of Long Now Boston. He serves as Chief Technology Officer at TechNext Inc., an early stage startup, and is a recent fellow in MIT System Design and Management. So Anurag, welcome. Thank you. And I have to confess, Anurag actually has credentials as a maintainer, a longstanding career involved in things. He worked at Honda for a number of years on their long-term strategic plan. So he's got credentials. I don't have maintainers credentials. I can't even, work a pair of pliers very well. So anyway, now we want to thank all of you that have come tonight with a, first I wanted to thank you for attending. I'm very excited about tonight. The story that Lee and Andy have to tell is very important and very fascinating. I loved the book. When I read it, it really changed the way I view maintenance as an occupation, as a passion, and as a mindset. So it's a great topic for Long Now Boston to be working in, and I'm looking forward to that. And we want to thank you by offering you a copy of the book, or at least one of you. So we're going to do a door prize. We used to do this at our live events, but have never tried it on Zoom. So Gary, can you bring up there we go. So, so here's the deal. We're going to ask you a riddle drawn from the book. And once we give you the riddle, you can make your guesses as to the answer in the chat function while we introduce the speakers. And the first correct answer will get a copy of the book mailed to them, signed. If you want, you can let us know. So let's see, Anurag, are you ready?
Yes, thank you, George, for the introduction. You're way too kind. So here's the riddle. It's also on the screen on the left. Buddhism and maintenance mindset are inspired by the same thing. What is that? One word. I repeat it again. Buddhism and maintenance mindset are inspired by the same thing. What is that? One word. While we're waiting for the answer, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Lee Vinsel is a professor in the Department of Science, Technology, and Society at Virginia Tech. Andrew L. Russell is a professor of history and the Dean of College of Arts and Science at SUNY Polytechnic Institute. Together, they are the founders of the Maintainers Research Network and conferences and authors of The Innovation Delusion. Their work and writing on the topic of maintenance have appeared in the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Washington Post, and Wired magazine. We are proud and excited to welcome Andy and Lee to the Long Now Boston community. Off to you, George.
Great. Hi, Lee. Hi, Andy. Let's get you up on Spotlight. I think Gary can bring them in on Spotlight. We'll get all of us up here. Okay, there's Lee. How you doing?
Good. How's it going?
Going great. There's Andy. Andy, how are you?
Fantastic. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming.
So I've been checking the chat to find out if anybody can answer it. And we've got some that are a little bit close. Travis has a couple in there, but why don't you explain the answer and then I will acknowledge the award.
I'm trying to remember where in the book that comes in, Andy.
I think it's infused through the whole thing, from
I know
the writing to the everything.
What is the answer?
The answer, it was in the book. Suffering.
Oh,
is
yeah.
the common thread. Suffering.
That? That's one of our buddies. Is that Dan Holbrook? It's one of our friends in the Maintainers Network said that. Wow, yeah. That's really funny. I'm glad it's in the book.
So Travis said frustration. I think that's close enough.
That's the closest, yeah.
So we'll give him the award. And Andy and Lee, we're going to turn it over to you now. And
thanks so much.
Looking forward to your remarks.
All right. Thank you for having us. You guys see that? And see my slide, hopefully.
Not yet.
Okay. Now do you see it?
Yep.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Okay. So thank you so much for having us. I think Andy and I we're going to talk about our book today, The Innovation Delusion, but I think it's just such a great fit. What we've been up to with the Maintainers and what Long Now Boston has been up to, that we're really looking forward to this conversation. And we also love that you all started with the Maintainers acknowledgement. We wish more events started in that way. It would be nice to head in the right direction to do this more often in our culture. So I want to talk to you about the Maintainers in this book we wrote. And usually I like to tell the story of how we ended up doing this, like this being our life, running the Maintainers, writing this book. And the reality is that it all started off as a joke. So you can kind of say that like a lot of my life is a joke, something like that. And what it came from is that Andy and I had grown like really frustrated with the way people talked about innovation in higher education and industry and, in journalism. There was so much chatter about innovation that it just kind of had become so silly and over the top. For a while we played with ways of criticizing this. So for a while I went around and gave a talk where I would pretend to be in an Alcoholic Anonymous style group called like InnoAnon, and be like, I'm a former innovation speaker basically. But the joke really kind of gelled and came together when this book, Walter Isaacson's The Innovators: How a Group of Hackers, Geniuses, and Geeks Created the Digital Revolution. And we thought, for professional historians had a number of problems with this book, but that really wasn't what spurred the conversation. It was that Andy said we should answer this book with another one, which would be called The Maintainers: How Bureaucrats, Standards Engineers, and Introverts Create Technologies That Kind of Work Most of the Time. And so what happened was I started playing with this on Twitter, and I was a blogger at the time. And then like the idea kind of started to take on a life of its own. So it took off on Twitter and in our professional society. And so we did two things. We held the first Maintainers Conference in 2016. And the same day the conference started, this essay, Hail the Maintainers, came out. And then it went from being like, whatever, a bunch of nerds getting a little attention on Twitter to being like, actually went kind of viral and got picked up by the Atlantic and Guardian. We got asked to write a New York Times op-ed. There was a Freakonomics episode about it, and eventually it led to the writing of this book. Now, there's a couple reasons I tell that story. First of all, I want to point out that like we lucked into this and fell into it with making jokes online, basically. So there was the initial joke, and then there was a lot of work to think through what the joke meant. And that was like what led to the book. You know, it took a lot of research and interviews. And the other thing is through that process, we learned a tremendous amount from other people. And you could almost see in the book, and we say this in the book, that it is a kind of gelling of a community in a lot of ways, and people that we're friends with. And so, you know, that's why we like coming to places like Long Now Boston, because we're really looking forward to like the conversation towards the end where we like can talk with all of you about what the ideas are doing for you. So here's an outline of the talk. I'm going to talk about what we call the puzzle of innovation speak. I'm going to talk about the innovation delusion suffocates maintenance and maintainers. Actually, that's where Andy's going to come in, and then we'll talk about the maintenance mindset. So we like to make a distinction between what we call actual innovation and innovation speak, okay? And one reason why we did that is because people started assuming that we're like Luddites, you know, like we hate new technologies or something, which is not at all true. We like our gadgets just fine, and we're very grateful for important innovations in our culture, like vaccines, for instance, and you know all kinds of other modern conveniences like air conditioning when it's super hot and things like this. But we are concerned with how people have come to talk and think about innovation in the last 50 years or so. So to talk about actual innovation, here's Joseph Schumpeter. He's an economist. He came up with one of the most famous definitions of innovation. He said there was like 5 new things you could introduce. You could introduce things, a method of production, a source of supply, a new market or application, a new method of organization. You can say, you know, we would turn maybe this last one or the last 2 into like a new business model is how we might talk about it. And innovation is greater than invention because innovation is the introduction of the new thing into society, where invention is just the creation of a new idea sit on a shelf, okay? It's a driver of change and has been, especially since the Industrial Revolution kicked off in the early 19th century. Wait, now to contrast that with innovation speak, we think about innovation speak as a kind of sales pitch of buzzwords and frankly gibberish a lot of time. It's often cast in a language of fear. So it could be that your nation's going to fall behind China, or it could be that your company is going to get disrupted by the Joe down the street, or it could be that your child's not going to perform well in the future economy because you didn't send him to coding camp or whatever. It could be lots of things, but it's often caught up in fear. And one place we see this is in the kind of discourse of disruptive innovation, was a very hot idea from the 90s to the present, and we hear lots of talk about it. And if you're really concerned about disruptive innovation, you could hire the late Christensen's InnoSight. It was a consulting group that would help you see innovation around you. But part of the issue here is that when social scientists re-examined Christensen's data, they found that only 9% of the cases that he covered actually fit his own definition of innovation. So part of what we're saying here is that a lot of ideas about innovation are actually not well-founded, even very popular ones. Like, you know, we way overvalue startups over established firms, for instance, and we can go on. So then we have to ask the question of like, how did it happen that the word innovation was so radically reappraised? Because in the church-dominated Middle Ages, when there was something called orthodoxy, innovation was a very bad thing to do. It was introducing new ideas, new church forms of worship and stuff, and it could literally get you murdered. You could get burned at the stake for being an innovator. It was a very bad role. So in 1548, the King of England, Edward VI, issued a proclamation against those that doeth innovate. So then the question is, how do we so radically reappraise this idea? Now, part of this, and this is where Andy and I are both historians of technology, is that we think part of the story of how we radically reappraised innovation is because of all the new technologies that we introduced beginning in the mid-19th century and continuing to the present, right? We've introduced all these things that have tangibly improved our lives, whether it's creature comforts or the speed of production or whatever. So there's actual technological change. And that's fitting because it was about the mid-19th century when you start seeing books written by people like Samuel Smiles, which was celebrating the lives of engineers and inventors, okay? Before then, in the 18th century, you did not want to be an inventor. It was like being a fraudster or a con man, basically, okay? It was not a role that you wanted to be. By the mid-19th century, it starts to be celebrated. And of course, by the late 19th and early 20th century, we have cults of invention around people like Alexander Graham Bell and such. Still, and this is where the difference between actual innovation and innovation speak comes in, it wasn't until after World War II that the use of the word innovation takes off, okay? And what I'm showing here is a Google Ngram. It's an algorithm that searches Google books and looks for word usage over time. So what you're seeing is the word innovation from 1800 to 2000, it's mostly staying flat, even goes a bit down. And then it's only in World War II, after World War II, that use of the word innovation starts ticking up. So the question is why? What's driving this word usage, okay? And there's a number of different ways we can talk about it. But one story we focus on in the innovation delusion is the role of economists. So in the late 1950s, economists are starting to see that the traditional things that are supposed to explain economic growth, like labor and capital, are not explaining it. They're nowhere near sufficient to explain all of the economic growth they're getting after World War II. So economists start hypothesizing that the hidden X factor creating growth is technological change, or what very quickly in the 1960s becomes known as technological innovation. And if you go into publications for the 1960s, you see like governments, especially governments, also universities and businesses saying like, innovation's giving us all the technological change, giving us all this economic growth. How do we get more of it? Okay, that's what it's all about. It's always about more. It's about growth. This kicks in very early. And as Andy's going to talk about later, I think this is where the long now question really comes in, because a lot of what that chasing growth becomes about is short-term thinking and like rapid gains, right? It's about profit making in the short term. Okay. Also another driver for this way of talking and thinking is that in the late 1970s, talk about innovation policy starts to bubble up. So it becomes clear that a role of government is to create policy to drive innovation ultimately. Okay. Now, the different parties have different philosophies. Conservatives want to cut regulation and taxes. The Democrats want to fund infrastructure and research or whatever, right? But it's the same thing. And then also in around the same time, the innovation policies starting to be like crop up as a term, you start seeing the first books written about Silicon Valley. And the first books written about Silicon Valley are really kind of like self-help guides for local planners to try to recreate Silicon Valley all over the nation, okay? And eventually all over the world. So, you know, there's going to be a Silicon Valley of India, a Silicon Valley of China. When I was in Australia giving one of these talks, the opposition party was talking about Kangaroo Valley was the hot, you know, they're going to have like an app economy or something in Australia. It was madness, but you know, it happened, right? This spread as a model. And so since in the present, from the, you know, what we see is this kind of rapid change, you know, like we see a kind of self-cycling gumbo of language develop that's often kind of like Silicon Valley associated buzzwords like killer app and agile and disruption, big data, all these things. Well, we know that there's costs though. Like the first thing is that like there's no proof that chasing disruption, for instance, actually leads to more disruption. Even though people like Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, will write like this 10 rules for entrepreneurship, chase disruption. That's probably not how it works, right? I'll come out like a libertarian here and say like, you can't plan this stuff from the ground up. You gotta, you know, it's the capitalist market working. I'll be probably burned at the stake for saying that, but there you go. Okay. And you know, the other thing is that we want to talk about is that as this term, the use of the term innovation is going up and up and up, you know, you can look at books like Robert Gordon's The Rise and Fall of Economic Growth that actually shows really economically deep innovation that creates growth and productivity shift really has slowed down since about 1970 or plateaued, okay? So the point then is we're talking more and more about this thing, but we're not actually getting more and more of it. There's no measure that would show you you're getting more and more innovation. And, you know, we also see, for instance, that Silicon Valley, for instance, is not a place you want to emulate everywhere in America. It's, you know, it's a very unequal place divided between haves and have-nots, including around education. There's homelessness. There's a lot of problems in Silicon Valley. It's not where, you know, Joliet, Illinois, where I grew up, should aspire to be Silicon Valley. That's, you know, no. Okay, here is a joke you like to make about innovation. So this is crack cocaine. You know, according to strict economic definitions of innovation, this is very obviously a significant innovation in the 1980s. It's a new product. It disrupts another product that's more expensive called cocaine. You know, there's a lot of risky entrepreneurship around it. Everyone wants it. The risky entrepreneurship is called drug dealing, yada, yada. You can go on and on. This is like according to very strict definitions of innovation. It's innovation. This guy is an innovator. You can think of the opioid crisis, for instance, as innovation, okay, in all kinds of ways, including illegal marketing. So this just says like, all right, well, innovation is not necessarily good, but that's how we talk about it, okay? And if you just want to get away from drugs or whatever for a second, you can also see that Fortune magazine called Enron the most innovative company in America for 6 years in a row before it kind of all came crashing down. So there's not really, we're not saying innovation's crime. I've already made an argument about technological change. What we're saying is we've come to treat innovation as this kind of implicit good, okay? And it can never be more than a means to an end. So then in a long now way, what you have to ask is, what are the ends we're trying to achieve? And there's other costs too, okay? And the other cost too is that while we're chasing all these shiny things, going for that short-term growth or whatever, we're also ignoring really important realities in our society, including that innovation delusion suffocates maintenance and maintainers. And now I hand it over to Andy.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Lee. And thanks, everyone. Let me try and make this work. Play from current slide. Lee, is that working? We're good? Okay.
Yeah, it looks good.
Thank you. So maintenance and maintainers are one of the casualties of the innovation delusion, as Lee was saying. There's others, but for the purposes of tonight, let's just focus on maintenance and start with some definitions and some framing. One of the problems we run into when we talk about maintenance is people start to kind of get it and they say, well, everything's maintenance. And so we need to kind of put some boundaries up here. So we think in terms of scales, and this is in the book when we talk about maintenance. This is infrastructure, the broadest societal scale. This is a picture of a park in Atlanta. At the meso level, or the level of organizations, there's maintenance, and this is a pump being worked on. I don't know if this guy's posing or if he's actually hammering on a wrench, and that's really how you fix those things. And then, of course, for individuals, healthcare workers really have become prominent in our minds about how we maintain ourselves and maintain individual health, especially during the pandemic. So these are the three scales: societal, organizational, and individual. And there's a bunch of different ways to define it. You know, you could start with a dictionary, very dry discussion of causing or enabling something to continue, or keeping things in good working order. I like that because it has a kind of nice ethic to it. Or in a more profound way, to provide with the necessities for life or existence. That's what it means to maintain. Maintenance, I don't know if it was Lee or our buddy Dan Holbrook who came up with this. I really like this definition, is a never-ending battle against entropy. We're always going to lose, but we're always going to try. And there's a constellation of affiliated concepts, such as stewardship, care, repair, and infrastructure. Terms very familiar to this group, Long Now Boston. In terms also we're happy to see have become more prominent in policy discourse and media discussions in the past 6 months or so, which is a refreshing change. The bad guy in our story, like your story, as Lee was saying, is short-term thinking. Now, there's a lot of discussion that's gone into why people, favor the short term over the long term. And there's a case to be made that there's evolutionary roots for that, if one attends to one's immediate threats, then one's more likely to survive over the long term. We're more concerned with contemporary incentives, and think again in those three scales, whether it's infrastructure, we see it in building out new highways or bridges instead of taking care of what we have. In business in particular, a lot of you are probably familiar with this really devilish development about shareholder value and quarterly reports, always driving companies to try and play up the what have you done for me lately, as opposed to what are you going to do for me 5 or 10 years from now. And of course, at the individual level, this is all so very intuitive. This is the reason why I don't eat Oreos for breakfast anymore, because I know even though it's good at the time, it's not really going to work out well for me in the long run. So when we're talking about different cover designs for our books, we're talking about maybe having a picture of someone's abs or a nice bicep being flexed, but we didn't do that. So what really concerns us, and one of the main reasons we wrote the book and why we're so happy to keep talking about it, is that we really think that this lack of recognition for maintenance and maintainers is a recipe for disaster. And so what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is talk you through how this plays out across these three scales. The first is American infrastructure itself. These reports seem to happen on a weekly basis, sometimes more frequently, about a bridge becoming inoperable, or a train crashing, or an entire model of aircraft from a leading manufacturer being grounded around the world. And so the report card for America's infrastructure, produced by the American Society for Civil Engineers, the nice graphic in the middle illustrates all the different aspects of America's infrastructure that get graded. And it makes for some really interesting reading, and it's really, I think, changed some policy discourse as well. I updated this slide, and recently America's moved from a D+ to a C-. For those of you in the university world, that's from terrible to just not good enough. One of the people who we portray in the book is Chuck Marone, who's the founder of this group, Strong Towns. Chuck's from Brainerd, Minnesota. And this is a really excellent series that I recommend to everyone, called the Growth Ponzi Scheme. The basic concept is that when communities build out a bunch of new infrastructure, whether it's roads or strip malls or sidewalks, and it's subsidized, there is this illusion of growth, this illusion of profit and wealth. But what we're building in is long-term liabilities that for communities like Lafayette, Louisiana, where Strong Towns did a big case study, it's the liabilities double the size of the tax base. They're just never going to catch up. And so there's something profoundly wrong with this way of thinking that we see again and again and again in communities across America, as well as in the decisions that policymakers make at the state and federal levels. At the meso level, at the level of the organizations, this one hits kind of close to home for Lee and I. This phenomenon of innovation campuses, we've got the Pennovation picture up here for those of you who've been in the University of Pennsylvania's campus. I think it's on the east side of the main campus. Campus after campus after campus is trying to do what Lee was alluding to before, trying to replicate the secret sauce that came out of the Stanford and Silicon Valley experience of the 1960s, 70s, and beyond. And so what this leads to for people like me who are trying to get resources to do things that the world tells us they need. They need students who can write well. They need students who can reason well and apply ethical concepts to difficult situations. It's tough for me to get those resources, but it's pretty easy for people to build a 6 or 7 or 8 figure campus in Philadelphia, or if you want to get Lee started, ask him about the Amazon campus in Northern Virginia, or check out the essay he wrote. I think it was in the Chronicle of Higher Education about that delusion. We see this in the world of business as well. As a native upstate New Yorker, this one also hits close to home. General Electric in 2016 put on a pretty big PR push, trying to reframe itself as the 124-year-old software startup. It sent engineers out to Silicon Valley. It adopted a fail fast ethos within the company. They really went for it, and they really failed badly. By 2018, General Electric was widely seen as a joke. And for those of you who hold stock in GE, or maybe your retirement's tied up in it, it became a real problem and continues to be a real problem, even after a change in leadership in the company. The shame is that companies know better. This is not knowledge that's elusive in some way. These are things that are known. Here's an example from our first maintainers conference by the computing historian, Nathan Ensminger. He developed this figure from a number of studies in the 1980s about software engineering. And this number, about 2/3 of effort in a number of different organizations going towards maintenance. This is pretty consistent with what we've seen in studies. Whether it's Swedish engineers or whether it's software companies doing a self-study of themselves. Even though all the talk is about design, and that's certainly what engineering programs teach their engineers, be good designers. What people actually do more often than not is maintenance. So there's no real mystery here. It's just getting to know oneself and then acting on that knowledge. So, at the individual level, again, a recipe for disaster is to neglect maintenance and maintainers. And there's nothing like a pandemic to really bring this lesson home, literally into everyone's homes. And as around a year ago, as the pandemic was really making its force felt, and as different communities were trying to wrap their heads around how they were going to make it through, there's one consistent theme with labor that kept popping up. It was that the essential workers, those who were celebrated with signs and songs, even opera, were actually people who were underpaid and undervalued systematically. They were women and people of color and immigrants. And so San Francisco found this, New York City found this, in Texas, they found the same thing. And global health authorities found the same thing. That by mistreating essential workers or by subjecting them to really terrible working conditions, we were not only hurting them, we were hurting all of us. And there's just something about our society that should really rub you the wrong way once you recognize this fact. We'll come back to the essential workers in a few minutes. Okay, but let's now we've laid out a case for what the innovation delusion is and what some of the costs are in some pretty specific ways that come with neglecting maintenance and maintainers. So the real question is, how can we change this? And how can we leave the world better? How can we be good ancestors, as Long Now likes to say? Our answer in the book is to adopt a maintenance mindset. So we've got a pretty quick definition of it, easy to remember. The maintenance mindset really boils down to 3 points. The first is that maintenance sustains success. And it doesn't matter what your definition of success is. To stay successful, you need maintenance. That's 1. 2, maintenance depends on culture and management. It's not just like a technical thing. There's no software program that you can just set and run. There's no magic wrench or tool. It is a human endeavor. Number 3, maintenance requires constant care. That is, you have to really keep at it, and you have to actually channel and unleash creativity that people have in order to keep improving. There's a continuous improvement thread here that we'll see in a minute. So let me walk through each of these things again to think about applications in those 3 different scales that I described a few minutes ago. So first, maintenance sustained success. Again, intuitive. Everyone's heard an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, or an apple a day keeps a doctor away. And we could quantify the cost of an apple and the cost of a doctor visit, but you get the idea. You all know this. In business, in the book, we talk about a really interesting study that took place from a commercial real estate consulting firm that found that the return on investment was 545% in a large telecom company. It was a Baby Bell. They don't name it, but they looked at all the different plant that they had and found that maintenance paid off handsomely. And when we talk to people in industry, and some of you have probably had this experience yourself, either as homeowners or in business, we hear stories like this. I got a $5,000 maintenance contract and it saved me $350,000 in downtime in an emergency replacement cost. The companies that do this well are companies that organization theorists refer to as high reliability organizations. And they're all names that you know. In fact, there are some of the names that I think are making this possible, like Amazon Web Services, Netflix. When they go down, they hear about it. The US Air Force, totally different context. You can be a fan of the US Air Force or a veteran, or you can be a critic of American imperialism and American imperial might. But the US Air Force really knows that it needs to be a high reliability organization, that when it needs to go, things need to work, and they measure that. Same in, say, operation rooms in theaters. And we talk to people at Johns Hopkins Medical School who talk about the importance of making sure that the chillers and the air handlers in their hospitals work all the time. Because when they need them, they really need them, and they need them all the time. Second point, maintenance depends on culture and management. Lee and I went to an industry conference a few years ago, and over again, we heard speakers from the coal industry, from the energy industry, from urban utilities come back to this slogan: the soft stuff is the hard stuff. And by soft stuff, they mean culture, they mean management, they mean getting people on their teams to understand that they need to not just buy the software, but use the software and build it into their routines. That's the hard part. There's not any elusive formula or chemicals or materials here. This is just sticking with it. Another company that we talked to is called Fix. They make computerized maintenance management software. It's a Canadian company, and they are very focused on sustainability. We could talk for a long time about the connections between sustainability and maintenance. I know that's probably a pretty important interest for this group. But what they say is sustainability and maintenance is the same word, that by maintaining things and making things last longer, we're contributing to a more sustainable world. Third point of the maintenance mindset is that maintenance requires constant care. Now, if you're in industry or if you're an engineer, you can go to books like this, Rules of Thumb for Maintenance and Reliability Engineers by Ricky Smith and Keith Mobley. Ricky's a consultant. You can hire Ricky as well, or there's a bunch of checklists in that book or elsewhere for how to keep your equipment in good working order. There's also companies that have moved into this space to provide software. So a company like Augury uses artificial intelligence to get into predictive analytics. This is kind of a hot innovation speak rich field. Upkeep is a startup. The founder actually was a Y Combinator alum in California. They're in Los Angeles, and they're a mobile first piece of software because they know that people are often out in the field. They're not sitting behind their desk. So their concept is the deskless workforce. And then 60 Hertz is someone who we met again, like Lee said, in the course of developing this topic and interviewing people. Piper Wilder is the founder of 60 Hertz. They're in Alaska, and they're an offline first maintenance management software company. So they don't take for granted that they're on a big fat pipe all the time, or even with a handheld device that can talk to the internet. So the assumptions change, but it's creative people building companies, developing tools whether it's an old-fashioned checklist or a piece of software that works in some pretty rugged environments. That's what we mean when we talk about constant care. Okay, so moving forward, what do we do? In terms of policy prescriptions, you know, we kind of stayed away from that. Lee and I are historians, and by nature, we're not out to predict the future or pick sides, because we've seen this game. Things change too quickly. But one thing we're pretty sure about is that a fix-it-first mentality really needs to be part of any kind of infrastructure spending, especially in the billion or even trillion-dollar level. Okay, so instead of building out, we need to maintain and fix what we have. Again, it's not just a matter of technology. We've seen this throughout the pandemic in this country and elsewhere, that we have ventilators. There are ventilators around. Even in that shortage, they were there. The problem was that they didn't work, that the policies, including intellectual property policies, as well as just funding to keep old equipment in good working order, those sorts of policies were absent. So, you know, even the best technology doesn't work if the policies and the organizations don't support it. At the levels of organizations, and then coming back to the essential workers, we need to celebrate maintainers. We also need to compensate them. And we need to do this in a variety of ways, whether it's a living wage, raising the minimum wage. We've seen a lot of advocacy, I think, working really well to put childcare and paid leave and elder care onto the square in the middle of the policy agenda in Washington. That's the kind of thing that we keep hearing when we talk to maintainers, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in industry, whether it's in education. That's what they say. You want to thank me, fine, but this is what I need. So we should listen to them. I'll note too, kind of as another way to hook into individual interests here, that these ideas also take root in individual passions as well. So these are two books about the repair movement, one by Sandra Goldmark and one by the late John Wackman and Elizabeth Knight. I really recommend picking them up. They're terrific. And what they've done is really document local repair shops as well as their connections to the national and now international right to repair movement, which is very much in lockstep with some of the ideas that we've been talking about here. And again, we get into some of these concepts in the book, so you can check that out when you pick up our book too. Okay, so just to wrap things up, here's what you should remember about the maintenance mindset: that it's foundational for success, it depends on culture and management, and it requires constant care. That's what we've got tonight. What we're going to leave you with is a call to join us. We are, along with Jessica Meyerson, our wonderful partner as a co-director of the Maintainers, building a movement for maintenance thinking and action. And what that means for us is really to get people to join our mailing list, which you can find at themaintainers.org. It's an eclectic list. It's a pretty low traffic list, but it's fascinating. It's everything from libraries and digital preservation to infrastructure policy to software to ventilator repair and right to repair. So there, you know, we could talk for a long time about what we're doing with the Maintainers, but it would be wonderful if you joined the list and contributed and let us know and let everybody know what makes you passionate about this subject. So I am going to stop there. That's the book. That's us. That's how you find us. Thank you so much for listening, and we're really looking forward to answering some questions and hearing from you.
All right, Andy and Lee, thank you for a great presentation. Really exciting. And there's a lot of questions and ideas that have popped up on the chat. And I wanted to follow one thread. Somebody mentioned, of course, the art of motorcycle maintenance, which goes back a ways, but touched upon some of these themes. And one of the things that strikes me is I know people who have great pride in taking care of things and building things and making things work, and it's an intrinsic value to them. And yet we seem to be in this culture where, you know, the novelty is the fashion, you know, novelty is the thing. And so, you know, talk a little bit about this sense of, you know, the emotionality of maintenance and the commitment to, you know, to having things that work, and, you know, what that means to people.
Andy, why don't you start with like Bill or yours, or, you know, yeah, go there. Like,
yeah,
so
like, yeah. So in the book, it's a great question, and I think it's a really important question. There's no replacement for intrinsic motivation. As educators, I think this is a painful truth. In the book, we interview a guy named Juris Milestone, who is now a professor of anthropology at Temple. He was a maintainer. He was actually a crew chief for the Air Force, and he tells a story about growing up. He didn't have a father, but he had, it sounded like a band of hippies, basically, a bunch of father figures. And he grew to love, he collects motorcycles now too. So he works on motorcycles. He's the embodiment of what Robert Pirsig wrote about and what Matthew Crawford wrote about. But he talks about a moment of joy in his upbringing where he was in a shop, and one of the guys looking after him, he might have been 10 or younger, put him into a 55-gallon drum, it was empty, put it on a magnet, and it had this kind of thing on the ceiling, tracks where you could move it around. And they gave him a controller. I imagine it's something like a kind of Nintendo controller, but who knows what it was like. And he was just zipping himself up there around in the rafters, and really got this sense of play and joy and belonging. That if you've ever spent time in a shop or spent time around that culture, really meant something to him, and it stuck with him even as he veered into the Air Force and then off into the academy. The poor guy, that passion stuck with him. So we've got a few stories like that in the book, but there's something really important, really foundational there. Lee, what do you think?
Part of it's like the identity of those folks. So like a lot of times people have stories like that about how the skills got into them, and also the passion, like how it became like a norm for them. Even sometimes like they're not just going to throw things away, right? If they can fix it, that's like part of who they are. And I think, why that fade in a lot of other social circles is a really complex question historically. But I think part of it's about disposability, So David Edgerton in his book, Shock of the Old, talks about like, it's more expensive now to fix a toaster, to take it to a repair person, than it is just buy a new toaster, And I think mass production, first United States with things like Ford, and then, globalization and China and all these things, mass produced things have just gotten so cheap that, I think this is one factor, that there's just not a lot of economic incentive to take care of things. They've just become, throw them out and forget them, get the next one.
Thank you, Andrew. That was a beautiful story. My father was head of maintenance at a railway plant while I was growing up. So my fondest memory since growing up is seeing machines being taken apart and being put together. And that was always like second nature to me, that things should be maintained and repaired rather than, throw away, because these were like really valuable things. I had a slightly different question again, building on the book, which is, and your lecture, which is, you have a critique of kind of capitalism in a way, or at least this marketing speak around capitalism, which is elevating some forms of labor and kind of focusing attention on things which are probably not, at least in your view, not as important as some of the other things, such as nurses and actual people who are taking care of us. And David Graeber comes at this in a different ways with his bullshit jobs work on how we kind of neglect essential work in some ways. So do you think that's a compliment or a different way of coming at the exact fundamental truth, or would love to find out your views on that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting overlaps with us and Graeber, but there's also some tensions. And I guess the tensions come out. So there's something else I guess we should put on the table about Andy and me. We're both like trained in basically the overlap between the history of technology and the history of business, and trained by these people who are very focused on organizations as like what has changed over the last 200 years, being like an organizational revolution is part of it. And, you know, we think that large organizations, like there's more, this is, you know, something I teach in my innovation class, more economic growth and innovation comes out of large existing firms than comes out of small ones by a long shot. Okay. And so we think we are really strong believers in organizations and expertise. Actually, you know, we're kind of defenders of bureaucrats in a lot of ways, in government too, by the way. We're not just like private sector guys, right? It's not just like, we think government expertise is really important. So, I mean, like what interests me is that like Graeber's metric for whether a job is bullshit or not is completely subjective. It's just like, I feel like my job is bullshit, so therefore it's bullshit, right? And I think it just doesn't like, as an organizational sociologist, kind of, I want to know more about that role and where it fits in this huge picture that maybe they don't have a really good feel for, honestly, right? And that's not to say like, bureaucracy is a problem. I work in a university. Don't even get me started, right? I can tell you there's like 20 layers of redundancy here that we could just blow up with a, you know, I don't know, something, a metaphor, not an actual bomb. And like, you know, it's like, it's not like I don't believe we have to cut down bureaucracy sometimes. There's lots of problems, but I think that, yeah, that's what I want from him, is like some other way of looking at it. But at the same time, think about essential workers and how they feel about their jobs. A lot of times is like, you know, is working at a grocery store a bullshit job? Probably feels like it really often, you know? So, I mean, I think it's a really interesting tension. Andy, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a communication problem as much as anything else. And maybe, you know, in the last 5 years, I've been a dean, I guess the last 6 years. And so maybe I've been more attuned to this, but if someone tells me, or if I hear that someone thinks that their work is meaningless, or why do I have to take this class, you know, then I think, you know, there are reasons. They might not like the reasons, but there are reasons. So I think it's an opportunity to help them understand the world and their place in it better. I mean, like Lee's example is a great example. A grocery store clerk might, you know, it might feel like drudgery, but it means a lot to me to have somebody help me get food. And so if that person doesn't understand that, or maybe understood and forgot it, then it doesn't mean the job's worthless. It means that there's problems in the culture of the organization.
Yeah, that's good. And you want them to do a good job when they do help you with the, you know, in the supermarket.
Yeah.
There's another thread happening in the chat that I think is pretty interesting, and it's kind of about different words that people use. You know, innovation is a word, invention is a word, and I think one of the questions is, it seems like innovation has become this, you know, the one guy that makes the killer app that becomes a billionaire. It's kind of this model of innovation is like this superstar kind of rocket. And yet, isn't it true that most significant innovations are built on a lot of little things? And so I wonder if you could comment about sort of the difference between innovation as this rock star concept and innovation as a technological evolutionary process.
Andy, you should tell them how we're also historians of standards, and that was how our relationship actually started. Is like historians of standardization.
Go ahead and run with it, and then
No, I mean, like, you know, I think that's when I was talking about the organizational picture of American society and all societies, you know, in the mixture of business and government and technology, you know, and when I said earlier to Anurag that like, we know more innovation comes out of large firms that working in heavy industry and stuff like this than comes from startups, right? And that's why, is because like these firms are just like, they build huge systems. And what do they build them out? They build them out of technical standards. Okay, so Andy wrote about the Bell system and the internet, and I wrote about automobile safety standards and the catalytic converter. This is how we build modern culture, is through these very small incremental changes over 200 years. That's modernity, is like little things being added together, all chained around, you know? And so we put way too much focus on like the single thing that comes along and sweeps everything away, when actually most of it's been this, you know, the fact that Andy and I can go to Hobby Lobby, or not Hobby Lobby, like Home Depot, and buy like a part for our bathtub that works when we get home, although it usually takes like 3 trips. Still, like, you know, the fact that it works is kind of like magic. And so that's how we feel. We're much more, I think the word being used was evolution in the chat, right? We're much more on that picture than the, you know, the sudden change model.
Yeah, there's I mean, there's a couple of bad interpretations of history and reality that underlie this sensational cult of the inventor thing. So even Edison, you know, was the first to, or not the first, but a big champion of teams, you know, of a factory approach to invention, not even innovation, but to invention. It's a team thing. So that's one part of it, but it got stripped of that collective origins because it's easier to tell a story about one great guy. The other really terrible story or mental model that's picked up speed in the last generation has been poisoned by software, because the costs of failure in developing software are so low that people think this like, hey, try something great, and if it doesn't work, oh, that's okay. You know, the whole serial entrepreneur thing only works when you're piggybacking on infrastructure like the internet or open source software that individuals can use and then try and make money off. And if it works, it works. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But hey, it's only code, as opposed to, hey, it's only a factory, or you know, something like that. So but I think, you know, it's actually, despite the high valuation of those companies, for the most part, they're very small portions of the economy. They don't actually make that much money. And many of them lose money and continue to lose money year after
VC
year.
like money, like a dumpster.
Yeah, they're just burning through it. So so what, you know, how they have become the mental model of success is something that needs to be, I think, explained and attacked a little bit more, because it's just wrong.
Yeah.
Earning $1 billion without actually making a buck, right?
Yeah, and like even
billionaire.
to pick on Uber and Lyft for a second, I mean, I think that the burning capital thing can have actually negative externalities, right? So if you make Uber and Lyft cheap enough that it's more appealing to do that than get on public transit, you know, and public transit numbers go down, that's actually a harm, you know? So it's just, we've ended up in a very weird place in terms of our expectations of new technologies and how we're using money. Yeah.
Yeah. Anurag sent me an article when we started talking about this event, and it was the story of the entire internet development, process ground to a halt because a 26-year-old believer in open source software got into a trademark dispute, and he pulled his stuff off of the registry, including 11 lines of code, and that 11 lines of code was used by everywhere all the time. And so talk a little bit about the right to the private development, private company development, and open source development, and the tension between those two.
Yeah,
Charlie Lee said, left pad.
Yeah, left pad,
That was
right?
the name
Exactly.
of the code.
Yep. Yeah, this was, I think, a turning point in many ways for the open source community. And I mean, I would love to hear what some of the people on the call think about it, because it sounds like at least Charlie knows something about it. But I mean, the short version about digital infrastructure is that it's all kind of a lab experiment gone into the wild, and there wasn't sufficient attention paid from the beginning of the ARPANET and through the internet, and then through all of this open source code that's at the foundations of so much critical digital infrastructure. There wasn't enough attention paid to, I mean, there's no nice way to say it, to how to act like grownups It is, I mean, in historical terms, it's a totally immature system. You know, it's 20, 30 years out, but it betrays its own immaturity by having flaws like the left pad problem, that someone, just because they feel like it, can pull a few lines of code and then the whole thing falls on its face. I mean, it's crazy. Who would, and you know, to think that people hold this up as a miracle of modern design or innovation is like bananas. I mean, what, you know, who would teach that this is how you should design a complex socio-technical system, is that you can have any number of legs that you can just swip out and the whole thing collapses. It's just nuts. So I think the community is having a reckoning with that, but there's path dependencies here. We're going to be stuck with some of those quirks, we'll call them, for a long time.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's one person doing interesting work on this is this guy, Thomas Strines, who's at the law school at NYU. And one of the things I really like about what he's doing is he's showing you really got to disaggregate open source software, because we call something open source software if it, you know, it fits certain criteria, but it might just be a toy, like maybe no one has ever downloaded off of GitHub or whatever, right? You know, and versus like, you know, there's other pieces of open source software. If it fell apart, you know, like our entire digital infrastructure and other things would go to pieces, right? And so you have like, in the important thing is like those big hubs, these big nodes are important because of how industry is involved, right? They're all things that industries deeply involved in. These things are very important of large infrastructures. So, I mean, it's just really, it opens up all kinds of fascinating questions, but some of it's, we have to start asking, well, like, what are the riskiest things, right? And how do we treat those things? It needs to have a different set of rule than like, you know, someone's class project that's posted on the web somewhere.
I would just add that it also speaks to this short-term obsession. The code or for left pad was essentially to add a margin, and with 6 lines of code or 8 lines that you could just write yourself in most projects, but to save space, we had this kind of bad practices. Whereas some of the largest open source projects, such as Linux or Apache or the largest server projects, they have very good practices on how to build repeatable code and how to maintain them. And actually maintenance is such a huge issue with that kind of open source software.
I interviewed a guy who works at Oracle for the book, and like, you know, it was amazing talking to him, because I was looking for innovate and maintenance horror stories, basically is what I was looking at. And it was just like Oracle, you know, he got lots of recognition. He did a lot of maintenance and he got a lot of recognition for it because everyone realizes how important it is there, right? It's such a huge part of what they do that you have, you know, especially in these software companies, you actually have some recognition around it and compensation, I'm sure too. So it's, you know, it's interesting where you see the smart thinking about it, I guess. Yeah.
And Sean had a related question on this about how to include, so since we're talking about open source, how to, with the place of the public in maintenance, because he makes this point, a lot of maintenance enters the public imagination as inconvenience, bills, road work, or even if utility lines, which kind of disrupt your home. So how do you think about changing this image and whether there is a place for the public in maintenance?
That's a really good question. You know, I mean, I think that's one reason why we kind of fall back on this cultural shift aspect of the argument that we're making, is that it's important to understand that so many aspects of the world that we live in we can take for granted because they've been well maintained. And so if we understood that, and if we had history books and TV shows about that instead of about Steve Jobs or, you know, pick your great white man, I think we'd be better off. That's kind of a first blush at it. I mean, it's true. It's true, right? In you know, you could think about it across cultures as well. Is another way to open up different ways of thinking about this topic. It's an important topic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like just like Long Now. I mean, I think it's the same game as you guys in a lot of ways, right? I mean, it's arguing, getting ideas out there. That's the hope. That's what we're gonna say.
Yeah, and that's a good segue to, we'll probably have to wrap it up and move on, but the question of, okay, so how do you stay upbeat? What are you optimistic about in this? I mean, obviously, the joke that started it was a little bit of an acerbic and cynical joke, but
Yeah.
it's launched something. It's got people, leaning in pretty strongly to the concepts. And so that's got to feel good. And so now take us out through the cultural change that we're going to see in the next 20, 50, and 100 years. How are you optimistic about that kind of a future?
I can take a shot, Andy.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that I see a lot of great conversations happening, especially right now, with like with the Biden administration, but it's not just the Biden administration. Even amongst conservative groups that I watch, I see some really interesting conversations happening. So I'm not a true believer, but I follow some of the people that I call them contrarian optimists, like Steven Pinker and people like Angus Deaton, just showing how much we've left poverty, how many hundreds of millions of people left poverty in the last 30 years. And I try to, just keep a balanced view about that stuff. We've, poverty, the experience of poverty in the United States is very different today than it was in 1960s. Most people who are poor have air conditioning today. About 90% of poor people do. That's because of mass production and things getting cheaper. So I try to keep those in view when I'm thinking about all the tremendously hard things we have to do, like work on climate change and work on racial justice, and think about all these enormous things, and hopefully it'll play out for the best. That's kind of where I'm at it with it. I don't know. What do you think, Andy?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Part of it that keeps me going is our experience in doing things like this and in running the maintainers and in being constantly surprised by the diligence of people who are doing things that you'd never know about, but are so essential for keeping my car on the road or keeping my kids healthy. And it's groups like your group, and it's movements like Right to Repair, and it's kids like Greta Thunberg. And one of the great joys of doing this book and trying to connect these different topics at these different scales is it really helped me understand that they're all kind of revolving around a common core, and whether it's maintenance or stewardship or care. Just a simple word like care as a concept is so powerful. And, I mean, part of it, I guess, is the privilege of my position. But part of it is also, if you make a choice to see those things, then you see how powerful they are. And how no matter what culture you're in, or no matter what industry you're in, or what stage of life you're at, that's there. And it's like Lee said, the long-term historical trend is unmistakable. It really is. What's agonizing now is how slow it's moving, because we're in it's what you got. It's your bread and butter. It's because we're in this narrow time frame that we think if progress doesn't happen within a few years, that we're doing something horribly wrong. And that's true. We could be doing a lot better, but these things just take time. That's the hard truth of it.
Well said. Thank you very much. So we're going to shift a little bit. I'm going to turn this back over to Jennifer, and then we'll kind of be resuming the chit chat with the whole crowd when we in just a minute. So Jennifer.
Thank you, George. So for everyone who's new to Long Now Boston, we have a tradition here where we head to the bar at the end of our event to continue the conversation. And this is something that we did at our live events. There was a bar downstairs from in the building we hold our events called Shy Bird, and we would gather down there and continue the conversation over a beer or a cider. But Lee, and Andy, thank you so much for this conversation tonight. It was wonderful. And thanks to all of you for joining us. And I want to make a special thank you again to all the maintainers of Long Now Boston.